Hello, I'm Mark Hewitt, the author of Hunted, the Zodiac Murders. What you're about to hear is the audiobook edition, narrated by Mark Redfield. But before we begin, I wanted to personally thank you for listening and invite you to join me in this exploration of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Part 2. 1 month after Sherry Jo Bates was murdered, a shocking letter arrived. The writer claimed responsibility, describing the crime in chilling detail and promising it wouldn't be the last. Was this a true confession or a twisted game of misdirection? Let's continue.
The confession letters. The investigation reignited 1 month after the killing with the arrival of 2 letters. On November 29th, an unstamped envelope addressed to the Homicide Division in Riverside was removed from the collection box in the main post office at 5 p.m. The block lettering, done in heavy felt pen, was likely a disguise of the true handwriting of its author. Inside, the RPD found their copy of the confessions letter. The very next day, a Riverside newspaper, the Daily Enterprise, today publishing as the Press Enterprise, received an unstamped envelope with a separate copy of the confession letter. Efforts to locate the identity of the typewriter used in the creation of the letters proved negative. The 2 letters were carbon copies revealing a common original that was typed, single-spaced, and used short sentences and minimal punctuation, only periods and commas. The letter type most closely resembled a font coming from a portable Royal typewriter, likely a Merit Pica 508, its specific font type an Elite Canterbury shaded. The original, from which the copies were made, never surfaced. There may have been 2 originals. Whoever had killed Bates wanted the police and the press to know details of the attack. He wanted them to know it was he who had placed a phone call, and he wanted others to know that he would kill again. Either that, or some hoaxer wanted to claim credit for an unsolved murder. The police had to consider every possibility. Whatever their source, the letters had to be investigated. In detail and tone, they sounded like authentic communications from Sherry Jo's killer. If the claims were sincere, whether the letters came from Bates' killer or not was immaterial. Someone had sent terrorist-like threats and used the federal postal system to communicate these, both of which were felonious activities. The writer had underscored his message by providing it in duplicate. Typed in all capital letters, the confession letter read as follows. The Confession, by blank. She was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead. She is not the first, and she will not be the last. I lay awake nights thinking about my next victim. Maybe she will be the beautiful blonde that babysits near the little store and walks down the dark alley each evening about 7. Or maybe she will be the shapely blue-eyed brunette that said no when I asked her for a date in high school. But maybe it will not be either. But I shall cut off her female parts and deposit them for the whole city to see. So don't make it too easy for me. Keep your sisters, daughters, and wives off the streets and alleys. Miss Bates was stupid. She went to the slaughter like a lamb. She did not put up a struggle, but I did. It was a ball. I first pulled the middle wire from the distributor. Then I waited for her in the library and followed her out after about 2 minutes. The battery must have been about dead by then. I then offered to help. She was then very willing to talk to me. I told her that my car was down the street and that I would give her a lift home. When we were away from the library walking, I said it was about time. She asked me, about time for what? I said it was about time for her to die. I grabbed her around the neck with my hand over her mouth and my other hand with a small knife at her throat. She went very willingly. Her breast felt very warm and firm under my hands, but only one thing was on my mind, making her pay for the brush-offs that she had given me during the years prior. She died hard. She squirmed and shook as I choked her, and her lips twitched. She let out a scream once, and I kicked her head to shut her up. I plunged the knife into her, and it broke. I then finished the job by cutting her throat. I am not sick. I am insane. But that will not stop the game. This letter should be published for all to read it. It just might save that girl in the alley, but that's up to you. It will be on your conscience, not mine. Yes, I did make that call to you also. It was just a warning. Beware, I am stalking your girls now. CC Chief of Police, Enterprise. The confession letter's unusual use of the word, quote, that, to describe Bates, rather than the grammatically correct, quote, who, end quote, would much later suggest that its writer may also have penned a strange follow-up letter that repeatedly made this same grammatical error. It is not out of character for a callous murderer to describe his victim as an inanimate object. If the Riverside police believed the letter writer and anticipated additional killings by the same perpetrator, they still did not suspect that they were up against a serial killer because the phrase did not yet exist. The only qualifier was the word, quote, murderer, end quote, for investigators in 1966, was that of, quote, mass murderer, end quote, used to describe anyone who kills more than one person in a single incident, for any reason and under whatever circumstances. But the killer would kill again, and write more letters, and make more telephone calls. Finally, years later, he would cease his campaign of terror. All this would be completed before Bob Ressler, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit BSU, would coin the term serial killer in the 1980s to distinguish those who kill repeatedly, 3 or more instances across expanses of time, often called a, quote, cooling-off period, end quote, from other types of murderers. The phrase serial killer would in time have to be further qualified to differentiate organized serial killers, those who premeditate and bring tools and instruments of their trade to the murder, from disorganized serial killers, those who utilize whatever is available at the scene. There are other types of, quote, serial, end quote, killers as well, such as paid assassins, gang killers, spree killers, and other types who repeatedly commit murders. Investigators attempt to discern 2 things about a serial killer: how they physically conduct the murder, and what mentally drives them to commit the murders, including the psychological effects of the act of murder on the serial killer themselves. With this information, investigators can begin to unravel the killer's modus operandi, and with luck, identify them before they kill again, or at least use their analysis in prosecuting the alleged killer. Entire volumes have been written on the science of behavioral analysis. It is beyond the scope of this work to recreate what other authors have already so admirably written on the subject. The confession letters, so called because of the title centered across the top of the page, were postmarked Riverside, California, and delivered despite their lack of postage stamps. The press copies were 8 inches wide by unknown length, since the top and bottom of the letters had been torn off by the writer for reasons unknown. The police attempted to identify the letter's author. Even when typed, a clever means of disguising any handwriting idiosyncrasies, letters can be traced to their creators. Typewriters have a unique signature that can yield a match for investigators who check the height of individual characters, distinctive wear patterns, or other unique characteristics of the specific letters. The writer of the confession letters apparently anticipated this. He sent only carbon copies of the typed original, possibly a 4th or 5th copy produced by a multi-layered sandwich of papers and carbon sheets. The text was therefore difficult to read and virtually impossible to link to a specific machine. Though titled The Confession, the text of the letters would more aptly be described as a narration of events infused with the promise of additional killings. The only, quote, confession, end quote, present was a taunting braggadocio. The killer was apparently proud of his work and looked forward to repeating it. The motive behind Bates' death, according to the letters, was revenge because of, quote, brush-offs, end quote, she had apparently given the killer, quote, during the years prior, end quote. This provided for the killer, in his eyes, a reason to kill not only Sherry Joe, but any other women he might choose. He promised to choose more. The police quickly accepted the authenticity of the letter. They felt strongly that the wording could only have come from the responsible party. By November 30, the RPD advised that they had reviewed news releases and none of them had mentioned the disabling of the middle wire of the distributor. Also, other points in the letters suggested to them that the writer was the killer. The manner of the murder was correctly described in the confession letters, as was the mention of a phone call to the police. His, quote, "It's about time," end quote, may even have been a veiled reference to his lost watch. As late as October 20, 1969, the RPD sent a memo to the Napa County Sheriff's Office, attention Captain Donald A. Townsend, declaring, quote, "The person who wrote the confession letter is aware of facts about the homicide that only the killer would know. There is no doubt that the person who wrote the confession letter is our homicide suspect." End quote. The argument would have been forensically bolstered had a piece of the blade been left at the crime scene. The letter writer had claimed that his knife had broken during the struggle, but no piece was located in or around Bates. In a follow-up report, investigators noted that if the responsible knife was ever discovered, it might have a piece missing or be broken. The police could not independently confirm the killer's claim. The police could also not confirm that a telephone call had been placed by the killer, another specific claim made in the letter. When a string of murders were perpetrated hundreds of miles away in Northern California, including a few that seemed related to the attack on Bates, the connection was eventually made. Some investigators became convinced that Bates' death was just one in a series that included the murder of a young couple outside Vallejo, 2 attacks on 2 other couples that would each leave a woman dead and a male survivor, and the brutal slaying of a cab driver. However, not everyone believed that the serial killer, who would come to be known as the Zodiac, was responsible for the death of Sherry Joe Bates. Many lists of the killer's victims omit Bates or relegate her to a list of possible victims. Such skepticism won many followers due to the unique aspects of the October 1966 attack. Bates was alone. She was killed by a slice to the jugular with a knife. The murder occurred in Southern California, and the follow-up letters were more poetic than the matter-of-fact style the killer known as the Zodiac would later employ. The Zodiac's future actions and communications would seem born of a different mind, in the opinion of many. Despite the differences that exist between the murder of Bates and the future killings of the Zodiac, the similarities strongly suggested to some investigators that Bates' murderer was in fact the same man who would in time terrorize the San Francisco Bay Area. The modus operandi, M.O., may have changed, as they often do between the kills of a serial killer, but to many the criminal signature clearly linked the events. Not only did the killer's actions during and after the attack match those of future murders, the behavioral details, ample internal evidence, details found within the letters themselves, demonstrated that the writer also penned the known Zodiac letters that would threaten the people of Northern California just a few years later. The behavioral attributes of the killer surrounding the attack that would link him to additional murders included writing taunting letters, sending multiple copies of nearly identical letters, placing a telephone call in connection with a murder, communicating with the authorities through the U.S. Postal Service approximately 4 weeks following an attack, and bragging to the police and the press through his mailings. Sending almost identical copies of a letter to more than one recipient was a rather unique activity. Bates' killer would do this twice, with the confession letters 2 times, and the Bates letters 3 times discussed below. The Zodiac would perform this action following attacks in Vallejo just 3 years later. While the killer claimed in the confession letters to have made a telephone call in regards to the murder, which remained unconfirmed, the Zodiac would actually call 2 times in post-attack behavior and write about one of these conversations. The timing of the confession letter, almost exactly 4 weeks after Bates' murder, would be the length of time between an attack and a letter or series of letters on at least 3 occasions surrounding Zodiac attacks. The killer's action of drawing the police and the press into the drama of the murder with plenty of taunting was another stunt the Zodiac would perform repeatedly. Additionally, many of the writer's unusual literary traits would follow him in future missives. Even though later communications would never be as poetic or contain the grammatical flourishes of the confession letter, the use of specific language, grammar, spelling, and punctuation would identify the same hand at work. The confession letters contained the unusual word, quote, twitched, end quote, incorrectly spelled with the second T omitted, as though the writer could not spell the word or wanted investigators to believe that he could not. The killer would do the same in 1970 using the word, quote, twitch, without a second T. Where the confession letter writer began a sentence with the word, quote, yes, end quote, with no accompanying punctuation following the word, he, in a future letter, would do the same. The confession letter writer advised that the letter be published, quote, for all to read it, end quote. He would later request the publication of numerous letters and parts of letters. Similarly, future communications may have incorrectly used ellipses, a series of periods, without any accompanying space, just as was present in the confession letters. Bates' killer twice started sentences in the confession letter with the words, quote, I am, end quote, a trait that would nearly become a staple of Zodiac mailings. In another, most compelling similarity, the confession letter writer compared a sex act to an incident of violence, and found in favor of the violence, noting that her breast felt warm in his hand, though only one thing was on his mind. This was exactly the same sentiment expressed by the Zodiac in the solution to the 3-part 408 cipher that would be composed in 1969, in which he claimed that killing was, quote, more fun than getting your rocks off with a girl, end quote. There are several possibilities that explain the similarities. The Bay Area killer had read about, studied, and attempted to copy someone else who was responsible for murdering Bates. 2 killers had independently stumbled upon an incredible coincidence of astronomical proportion, or one murderer was responsible for the confession letter and evidently the death of Bates, and additional murders in Northern California. There is also the faint possibility that 2 killers operated, as some have hypothesized, one in the north and one in the south, the one in the north writing all of the communications and thereby claiming in Bates a murder he did not commit. However, as details will bear out, this is in the view of many a highly improbable occurrence. In 1971, the serial killer commonly known as the Zodiac would claim Sherry Joe's murder as his own, calling it his, quote, Riverside activity, end quote. He did this only after an article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle reporting on the connection between that murder and the Bay Area killings. The Zodiac may have been admitting to the crime merely because the series had been made public, and he was acting on a desire to regain control of the flow of information. He would add, quote, there are a hell of a lot more down there, end quote, referring to other supposed murders for which he was responsible in Southern California. From first receipt of the confession letters, the authorities in Riverside believed that their creator was in fact the killer. The narration of events outlined in the communiques had the feel of a murderer reliving his encounter, and the description of the small knife and the wounds to her head, throat, and neck would corroborate with the autopsy details. Though it was possible that someone close to the investigation could also have possessed enough knowledge to create such missives. Even if the writer of the letters was not a cop, he could have overheard a conversation somewhere or picked up the knowledge in any number of ways, such as befriending the family of an officer. The RPD at the time held the opinion that the writer was responsible for the death of Bates. The RPD also believed the motive stated in the confession letter, and began a search in earnest for a spurned love interest. This would prove to be a firmly held belief on its part, a dogma that would continue to petrify over the years. The FBI was ushered into the case to evaluate the letters. The field office in L.A. requested that the FBI laboratory do an examination of the confession letters, making the request in an Airtel dated December 1, 1966, which was received 2 days later. An Airtel was, in essence, an internal memorandum and was often used as a cover letter to describe the contents of a package of documents. More urgent messages were sent via teletype directly to the receiving location. The use of Airtels was inefficient and was later replaced by more effective means of communication. But in 1966 they were in common use by the offices of the FBI. Responding on December 22 to a letter sent by the RPD on the 1st of that month, the Bureau presented its professional analysis of the confession letters, opening FBI file number 9-46005-1. After a consultation with U.S. Attorney John F. Laley in Los Angeles, it notified Riverside that extortion could not be considered because no specific targets were named or clearly identified. As requested, the FBI searched its anonymous letter file to find similar threatening communications. Nothing of use was found, and the confession letter was added for future reference. In their correspondence with the FBI, the RPD shared some of their progress on the case, including the fact that there were no suspects, that they believed that the murder occurred around 6 p.m., and that the killer was likely also responsible for the letters. The Bates letters. At the 6-month anniversary of the Bates attack, probably in response to the newspaper coverage of the crime, 3 more letters arrived. These short, 8-word notes, each written on a single piece of ordinary lined loose-leaf binder paper, provided little new information to the authorities. 2 of the letters declared in mostly block lettering, quote, "Bates had to die, there will be more," end quote. They were addressed to the RPD, Riverside Police Department, Riverside, California, and the Daily Press, 3512 14th Street, Riverside, California. Joseph Bates, grieving father of the deceased, received a nearly identical iteration that was in title case, addressed Joseph Bates, 4195 Via San Jose, Riverside, California. Quote, "She had to die, there will be more," end quote. At the bottom of the letters sent to the police and press, a small symbol, appearing to the police to be a Z with a flourish, was centered, as though it were an identifying signature. The marks may have been used to distinguish these 2 notes from the alternate version of the letter sent to the victim's father, which replaced the word, quote, "Bates," end quote, for the more appropriate word to the father, quote, "she," end quote. The squiggles may also have been interpreted by some as a numerical 2 and a numerical 3, both later altered to look similar to one another, making them originally function as page differentiators, the letter to the victim's father being an unmarked first page. Each of the 3 envelopes bore 2 4-cent Abraham Lincoln stamps and was postmarked April 30, 1967. It would not be for more than 3 years, on November 16, 1970, that Sherwood Morrill, the state of California's questioned documents examiner, identified the Bates mailings as having come from the same author of numerous Zodiac letters that had been sent in 1969 and 1970. At the time they were received, the RPD wondered what, if anything, these notes could add to the case. The Desktop Poem. Earlier, sometime in December 1966, a custodian at the RCC library, while stowing furniture in a separate storage room, discovered a desk whose soft plywood surface had been defaced with a poem. The desk was likely available to students in the library around the time of Bates' murder. Its doggerel, if tied to the killing, was only obliquely related. The prose went as follows: cut, clean, if, red, clean, blood spurting, dripping, spilling, all over her new dress. Oh well, it was red, anyway. Life draining into an uncertain death. She won't die. This time. Someone'll find her. Just wait till next time. R.H. Etched with a blue ballpoint pen, the words appeared to describe the unsuccessful suicide attempt of a woman wearing a red dress. The only real relationship to Bates' murder were the protesters' references to death, to cutting, and to blood. Bates did not wear a red dress on the night of her demise. The poem may have carried no connection to the case at all. The desktop message was signed at the bottom by the initials R and H, interpreted by some to be the initials of the killer of Bates. The letters could also have been a reference to blood typing, which distinguishes a blood's Rh factor. At the time of the murder, the president of RCC, where the murder occurred and the poem was discovered, was R.H. Bradshaw, another possible reference to the two signatory letters. Even, quote, Robin Hood, end quote, had to be considered as the correct interpretation of these initials. Because of its possible connection to the murder, the tabletop poem was dutifully collected and preserved by the police for its future forensic value, along with the entire surface of the desk. It would reemerge in time as an important piece of evidence when Sherwood Morrill of the FBI matched its lettering to future Zodiac letters. At the time, however, the tabletop and the 3 Bates letters were not considered to be real evidence in the case. They were presumed to be the product of a copycat or hoaxer, or possibly two, and were promptly filed away. Dated November 1, 1967, just past the 1-year anniversary of Bates' death, an unusual letter signed, quote, "With hope, Patricia Hotz, fellow student," end quote, arrived at the desk of the editor of the Press Enterprise. The typed page referenced a previous article in the newspaper, the writer suggesting that another story about the boy responsible for the killing could be, quote, "more rewarding," end quote. It could cause others to think about the lives of their own children, the note suggested. Quote, "Are we laying the blueprint for another killer?" End quote, is a question the writer hoped might be brought to mind by such an article. Not only was there no boy to report on, no Patricia Hotz could be located, leading to suspicions that the note was tauntingly authored by the killer. The mysterious writer was never publicly identified. If the letter was a hoax, it was a puzzle to the police as to why someone might compose it and send it. If Bates' killer himself was responsible for the effort, perhaps he had a message to convey, or he hoped that the public would take something instructive away from his brutal attack. Many years later, one journalist laid claim to locating a Patricia Hotz, now living under her married name, who admitted to writing notes to editors around that time. Though she provided handwriting samples that could be compared to the Hotz letter envelope, her claimed desire for anonymity prevented any public confirmation of authorship. In other words, though the missive remains an enigma, it may have been an innocuous letter to the editor. Nearly 3 years later, on October 20, 1970, the RPD sent a letter to the Napa County Sheriff's Office, attention Captain Donald A. Townsend, as a follow-up to a telephone conversation that was conducted 3 days earlier. In it, Sergeant H.L. Humsher of the Detective Division outlined his reasons for believing that the Bates murder was directly related to a series of killings in the San Francisco Bay Area. Even though Riverside was a long way away from the Bay Area, there appeared to be a sufficient number of similarities to investigate whether there was provable linkage between the two cases, a common criminal signature and a similar modus operandi, possible evidence that the same killer was responsible for the entire collection of murders. Of particular interest were the similarities between the attack on Bates and a subsequent attack at Lake Berryessa that had occurred in September of 1969. Both involved the damaging or defacing of a Volkswagen automobile. Both ended with a knife attack. Both involved the murder of a woman, and both led to the subsequent taunting of the police with notes and possibly a telephone call. Latent fingerprints lifted from Bates' car were eventually compared by the FBI to prints that were collected from the Volkswagen Karmann Ghia at Lake Berryessa, but they provided no match. The Bates prints were never identified or matched to anyone else either. They remained with the FBI, file number 32-27195. The RPD letter included several enclosures: 2 reproductions of the confession letter, a photo of the envelope received by the press, a photo of the envelope received by the police, and 2 photocopies of envelopes after having been processed for prints. A copy of the letter was additionally sent to the San Francisco Police Department, SFPD, Chief of Police. The entire package was signed by Sergeant H.L. Hamsha, with the letterhead backing of L.T. Kincaid, the Riverside Chief of Police. The death of Sherry Jo Bates became the focus of renewed attention in 1982, Riverside officials expressing confidence that the case would soon be resolved. In a press release on May 20, the RPD reported in response to substantial pressure put on it by the press and the public that in November 1981 new information had come to light. Accordingly, 4 investigators had been assigned to the case full-time. They would be tasked, the press release notified, with interviewing numerous people and re-examining all the physical evidence available. The RPD denied that there was a connection to other cases in Northern California. The detectives expressed an awareness of an individual who was being considered by the SFPD and adamantly maintained that the Riverside suspect was not responsible for additional murders to the north. Nor was the man being investigated in the Bay Area responsible for Bates' murder. Any speculation and creative reporting could hamper successful prosecution, the press release warned, and any media reports that linked the murder of Bates to the killings in the Bay Area were outdated. The RPD promised a thorough investigation for 90 days before anyone would be charged, a sentiment that was to prove overly optimistic and unnecessarily confident. No one was charged after 90 days. No one was ever charged. Due to privacy concerns and the fact that the suspect was never arrested, the RPD never publicly shared his name. Nevertheless, some members of the RPD remained convinced that they had identified the perpetrator but were merely unable to gather sufficient evidence to bring the case to trial, and that he was not responsible for any Northern California activity. No credible evidence against their suspect ever leaked out of the department, and no follow-up was ever provided to the 1982 press release. However, the department's dogmatic stance would be challenged less than 2 decades later. In 2000, mitochondrial DNA testing was conducted on the blood clot discovered on the base of Bates' right thumb. The resulting sequence was compared to mitochondrial DNA testing done on blood drawn from the RPD suspect. There was no match. The RPD suspect was not the origin of the biological material deposited on the victim. Services for Sherry Jo were conducted at St. Catherine's Catholic Church in the sanctuary that she had visited with her father just hours before her death. Detectives observed the attendees, while police photographers captured faces on film. Sherry Josephine Bates was laid to rest on a misty hillside at Crestlawn Memorial Park, into which she was interred on November 4, 1966. 20 years later, her body would be exhumed and cremated, and her ashes scattered at sea. The man responsible for her death would not remain so quiet.
A killer who craved attention, a pattern of taunting letters, and a mysterious signature that would soon appear again. Was Riverside the beginning of the Zodiac's reign of terror? The evidence was mounting.